Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and a very good morning. Distinguished guests, respected scholars, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the International Institute of Advanced Islamic Studies, IAIS Malaysia, it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to today's public lecture entitled Embedded Islamism, Evidence from Southeast Asia. We are honored to host Dr. Ermin Sinanović, Executive Director of the Center for Islam in the Contemporary World, CICW, for what promises to be a stimulating discussion on the evolving relationship between Islamic movements, political institutions, and governance in Southeast Asia. Thank you for joining us this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, we shall now proceed to the main session for today's program. To chair and moderate the session, it is my pleasure to invite Mr. Wan Naim Wan Mansor, Deputy Head of Research Publications, IAIS Malaysia, to take the floor. Mr. Wan Naim, please.
Thank you very much, Mas, for the kind introduction. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh. On behalf of IAS Malaysia, it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you today to today's public lecture entitled, as Mas has mentioned, Embedded Islamism, Evidence from Southeast Asia. We are especially honored to welcome our distinguished speaker, Dr. Ermin Sinanović, a globally respected scholar whose work bridges political science, Islamic thought, governance, and Southeast Asian studies. Dr. Ermin is certainly not a stranger to IAIS. He has visited us on several occasions over the years, including during the time of Prof. Muhammad Hashim Kamali. And on a personal note, I have also benefited from his scholarship. I still remember while working on an article that I co-authored with Dr. Ahmad Badri on the tyranny of majority in Islam. I found myself returning to Dr. Ermin's work, particularly his efforts to connect classical concepts such as Ijma, Sawadul Azam, and Jumhur with contemporary understandings of majority rule and democratic legitimacy. So these are kind of the works that Dr. Ermin is working on, and I enjoyed it very much. So it is for me personally, and for all of you, I think it's a special privilege to welcome such a scholar whose work many of us have engaged with intellectually. So what makes today's lecture particularly timely is that it engages one of the most important debates in contemporary study of political Islam, the question of whether we have entered a post-Islamist era. I see Dr. is here, is also an expert in post-Islamist studies. So influential scholars such as Asif Bayat, Olivier Roy, and in different ways, Gilles Capel, have argued that classical Islamism has either evolved, moderated, fragmented, or exhausted much of its transformative political appeal. So many observers consequently suggest that Islamism has declined as a mobilizing ideology, giving way to a more technocratic, pragmatic, or post-ideological forms of governance. Yet, the Southeast Asian experience may tell a more complex story. In Malaysia and Indonesia, for instance, the influence of political Islam is no longer found primarily in political parties or street mobilization. Rather, it is increasingly visible in what scholars describe as the bureaucratization of Islam. What it means is the embedding of Islamic norms within courts, ministries, educational systems, regulatory frameworks, and other state institutions. The question, therefore, is no longer simply whether Islamism matters, but how it governs, adapts, and reproduces itself through the machinery of the state. So if I understand Dr. Ermin's argument correctly, and he will soon tell us whether I'm correct or not, This is precisely the phenomenon that the concept of embedded Islamism seeks to capture. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Ermin Sinanović. Over to you, Doctor.
Does this work? Can you hear me? Okay. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa bihi nasta'een. Wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulihi al-amin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you so much, Dr. Bedri, and the staff of IIS for inviting me to this talk today. Like you said, I'm not a stranger here. I visited here several times. I'm not stranger to this area because I used to study at UIA in PJ, which is nearby, and would often actually cut through UM when we used to go to KL because it was a shortcut when they would open the gate, of course. And so would pass this area. This was before IIS. Yes,
The gate is still open.
still open. That's how I came actually now. So that was more than 30 years ago, actually. And it's been a long time. You know that I visited Malaysia now last year, but during COVID, those few years I did not. So it's always good to be back. It's always good to come here because there is a different, I would say, a different gel of even air in Southeast Asia compared to many other countries of the world and regions. And so I think this idea of embedded Islamism that I will talk about is perhaps uniquely present in Southeast Asia, in Malaysia, Indonesia. And we can talk toward the end of my talk and during our discussion to what extent could this be relevant for, let's say, Muslims in other parts of the world, in the Middle East and so on. So we'll start about the topic and I will go over some of the basic arguments and brief 2 case studies that will showcase my argument, and then some conclusions that will, inshallah, come out of the presentation, and then we can engage in a conversation. So do we have the presentation? We do. Okay. So today is 24th of Dhul-Hijjah, 1447. Yesterday I gave a talk at ISTAC about decolonizing Muslim futures, and part of decolonization is to actually use the Hijri calendar before the other one. It's always good to read old books and old manuscripts where you will find people using the Hijri calendar as the regular form. And I remember when I was a student here, Utusan was still published in Jawi. I don't know if they still have it. I don't think so. But you could go on a daily basis when you buy newspapers and you could see Utusan in Jawi. And I think this should be preserved. It's part of the tradition, and not everything new is good and better. So let me introduce then this argument. The argument for a while has been that Islamism has failed, that the Islamists have been unable to translate their own ideas into a viable blueprint. They have not been successful in capturing power through democratic means for the most part, and that they've been unable to capture the imagination of the wider Muslim population and get support for their program. And so this argument claims that political Islam is in retreat, that, as you have said earlier, Islamist movements have moderated, embraced pluralism, become technocratic, and I could tear apart that argument, but I'm not going to engage with the minute details because it was gonna take a long time. And Southeast Asia is actually cited by these authors as evidence for that. And they say, and they basically equate electoral containment with ideological decline. Just because Islamic political parties have been unable to get majority or plurality of votes, that in a way shows their ideological decline. My paper and my argument is a corrective to this understanding. I argue that Islamism hasn't faded, it has actually embedded itself. It migrated from movements into state institutions. So the new sites are not elections and political platforms by Islamic political parties, but institutions like Jakim, MUI in Indonesia, the halal law, pesantren, education, and so on. And by embedding themselves or their ideas within institutions, the Islamists or Islamic political parties have actually become impervious to electoral success or defeats. And so the durability of Islamist programs and ideas persists across elections and coalitions. And I am going to unpack this argument in the rest of the presentation. So I don't think for this audience I need to introduce who are the Islamists and what Islamism is. I think we all have a pretty good idea. One thing I will at the outset try to clarify is that people may get confused when I'm making presentation. They would say, but these state institutions you're talking about, these are not Islamists. These are not Islamist institutions. These are state policies. My argument is precisely that what Islamists have originally advocated for had become state policies without the Islamists actually winning elections or governing the majority in the parliaments of these two countries. And so I introduced the concept of what I call embedded Islamism. And by that, I mean the institutionalization of Islamist norms within the state or within state structures, whether they be legal, administrative, educational, and regulatory, such that those norms govern routine public practice independently of the electoral fortunes of Islamist parties. In other words, you have Islamist policies, you just don't have Islamists in power. And in a way, depending how you look at it, that could count as success for Islamism because they have gotten what they always wanted, which is that the state actually adopts the policies they advocated for, minus, of course, their own access to government institutions directly for the most part. Of course, they do, but not fully as, which they would have if they had majorities. So what is different about this argument is that classical Islamism was movement-oriented. If somebody wanted to study Islamism, they would study Islamic movements like Abim or Jim or Muhammadiyah or, I don't know, some other movements in some other countries, and or the Ikhwan in the Arab world, and would base on their statements and platforms and books produced by people affiliated with those movements. They would then base the judgment to what extent Islamists have succeeded or failed in their own approaches. It is different from post-Islamism, which is about the narratives of decline of Islamism, and passive revolution, which talks about neutralization of Islamists and so on. So what I'm saying is that Islamism is embedded because it is institutional. It has, that the site of analysis for me changes from not party platforms or movement rhetoric, but actually state apparatus, bureaucracies, courts, agencies. I remember even I, in the past, have done these studies on Islamists by doing the second part. So I remember when PKS emerged in Indonesia, I studied their political platforms and programs and the electoral success and how many people they have in the parliament and so on, until it dawned on me that if we just change the site of our study, it would actually reveal much more about Islamism than you could get just by looking at their political platforms or electoral outcomes. They are durable because they operate through bureaucratic routine rather than mobilization, And for that reason are insulated from electoral volatility. I will immediately introduce this to you. If in the next Malaysian elections, whether they be at the end of this year or next year, UMNO becomes the governing majority, or the PM is from UMNO, or Pakatan, or PAS, do you think that's going to change anything much about the way that JAKIM operates, Islamic education operates, or anything like that? I don't think it's going to change anything. And that precisely is what I'm talking about here, and it will become clearer when I unpack this argument and actually do my case studies. Actually, the policies that Islamists have originally advocated, which is, let's have more Islam in education, let's Islamize the economy, let's have Islamic banking and finance, let's have Islamic universities, let us have more Sharia laws, let us have halal food and certification. All of these things have become a daily routine now in Malaysia. And so you don't need PAS to be in power, or ABIM, or JIM, or any other Islamist actor in order for these policies to be embedded within state institutions and to continue regardless of the electoral outcome. The only way it could change is if you suddenly, people in Malaysia had lobotomy, and you would have a truly liberal party come to power and say, we want to undo all of these things. We don't want state to do anything with religion. Or if non-Muslims would win majority in the parliament, and that, that's simply impossible just looking demographically. And so regardless of who comes to power, it's going to be Malay-led government, and as long as it's the Malay-led government, you're going to have these policies in place, whether it's PAS, UMNO, Pakatan, or maybe some other new actor that may emerge in the future. And so let us now do what academics usually do. Let's engage literature a little bit. Of course, some of the most prominent advocates of the failure of political Islam, or the change and evolution of political Islam, or post-Islamism, are Olivier Roy, his famous book, The Failure of Political Islam, which claimed that the Islamists have failed to translate ideology into governance blueprint, and that political logic overtook religious logic. And then came Asif Bayat with his post-Islamism claim that Islamists have become basically exhausted. And that produces Islamism, which fused religiosity with rights, faith with freedom, and so on. And I wrote a short review essay of these claims about 20 years ago. But back then, it wasn't as obvious to me, and it probably wasn't even as present in practice as it is today, this idea of embedded Islamism. And so my take on Olivier Roy, just, very simplified, is that he conflates strategic retreat with ideological abandonment. Because even though the Islamists in most countries in which they contested either did not win elections, or they won elections and they were forcefully kicked out of power, like in Egypt or Tunisia and so on, did not necessarily abandon their ideological commitments. They may have changed their political strategy, but their ideological commitments, for the most part, remain the same. Asif Bayat, problem with his argument post-Islamism is that it focuses on movement, as I said, not the institutional sediment that they leave behind. And even when I look back at my work previously, where I have argued that, yes, there's been some adaptation by the Islamists, but it doesn't mean that they have abandoned their ideological orientation. Now we know that adaptation is more institutionally consequential than initially recognized. So you could have adaptation without sacrificing the original ideas and the original platforms. So what I will do is, and I will jump quickly into this because I don't want to make this into an academic discussion. Let's discuss literature and arguments and this and that. Maybe that would be good for during dissertation defense, or, I think for us here, it's much more important to go into these case studies. So the two case studies from Southeast Asia are obviously Malaysia and Indonesia. So in the case of Malaysia, you have several micro case studies that belong to this larger study case. If you look, for instance, at JACIM and federal bureaucracy, JACIM was created in 1997, right? Not too long ago, less than 30 years ago. And one could argue, as I would argue, and I will argue, that many of the policies that the government has instituted, starting from the early 1980s, you know, what used to be known as the Islamization policies, you know, when Mahathir was prime minister, he brought Anwar on board. And then you had the creation of Bank Islam, IIUM, you had institutionalization of these policies. My argument is precisely that all of these policies are the policies that were initially advocated by Islamist political actors, whether they be Islamic movements like ABIM or Islamic political parties like PAS, in order to outbid and outdo and out-Islamize the Islamist opposition. The government, under the leadership of Dr. Mahathir Mohamad at that time, decided, you know what, we are going to do all of this. And I don't think they initially, even intentionally, they said it that way. But the idea was that if the government is already doing it, then there will be no need to vote for the opposition. If the government is already implementing all the policies that the Islamists are asking for, there is no need to vote for the Islamists, for the Islamist opposition. And that's exactly what I think the statement that Mahathir made in 2001, when he said, "AMNO wishes to state loudly that Malaysia is an Islamic country. If Malaysia is not an Islamic country because it does not implement hudud, then there are no Islamic countries in the world." And you would remember later on, there was this proclamation that Malaysia is Negara Islam, and people started debating, what does that really mean? Is Negara Islam Islamic State? You know, does that translate really faithfully into English or not? But the thing is, since we are already an Islamic state, but PAS is calling for Islamic state, but we already have it. Why would you go to PAS and vote for PAS when we have already created it? So we are already there. There's no need for that change in the government. There is no need to go and listen to PAS Chirama and what have you, because the government is already implementing all of that. You know, they wanted more Islamic education. We'll put Islamic education in primary school and high schools and everything. We're going to create Islamic universities. You know, when I came here, there was the IIUM. How many Islamic universities you have now? All over the place, right? You know, there's so many. So you want Islamic education? Here is your Islamic education. You want to make sure that everywhere you go, you can eat halal. We're going to make halal laws. We're going to make sure that when people go, it's certified. You don't have, I remember, you know, back in the 90s, they used to have these signs, Ditanggung halal, Tidak Ditanggung halal, right? Halal sign wasn't as widespread as today. I remember even, you know, you pass by KFC and they say Ditanggung halal. Now, of course, it's all institutionalized. There is halal logo by JACIM, MS 1501 standards and whatnot. And you just see that logo and you know, okay, it's halal for me to eat here. I know, you know, the state is behind this. There is support and so on. All of the things that in the 70s and the 80s, Islamist movements and parties criticized about the government not being Islamic enough, the government has pretty much done in the meantime. And that is what constitutes embedded Islamism. So Islamic finance, for instance, you know, there's a lot of critique, first of the capitalist economic system that is riba-based and so on. And so there was pressure and the government adopted. Malaysia is #1 Islamic finance hub in the world, right? Today. It is heavily regulated by Bank Negara, right? There are boards that regulate all kinds of different policies under which banks operate. And yes, of course, you could make a critique of Islamic banking and finance as being embedded within the capitalist system and so on and so forth. And I have also written about that. But there is no doubt that there have been great movements and strides made in order to make it, you know, more in line with maqasid or more in line with the larger, you know, objectives of Islamic economy. And actually, by the way, tomorrow, we are launching a new book about Dr. Muhammad Najatullah Siddiqui, who is one of the pioneers of Islamic economy and banking at IIUM in Gombak. And the Prime Minister actually wrote a foreword to that book. And it's a very, very good foreword because he reflects on the journey of Islamic banking and finance, both in his personal meetings with Dr. Najatullah Siddiqui, but also what Malaysia has done, where is it today, and what it needs to do to make it truly, in line with the maqasid and with the bigger, principles of Islamic economics, not just procedural, fiqh-based, and so on. And so if you look at it, today Malaysian state institutions are employed in order to facilitate this thing. And Islamic banking and finance, in many ways, Muhammad Najatullah Siddiqui was part of Jamaat Islami in Pakistan, right? In India. And many of the pioneers of Islamic banking and finance were affiliated with Islamic movements. So what used to be an Islamist desire, so to say, preference, has become state policy over time, without Islamists winning the elections. So again, just another example and another side of that. And so the key insight is that embedding persists across PAS, UMNO, Pakatan coalition flux. And this is what I told you earlier. Regardless of who wins the next election, do you think any of this is going to change? Do you think somebody is going to come and say, okay, we're stopping all Islamic banking and finance, there is no more? There'll be a complete, outcry about that. There'll be riots about it, Nobody is going to change and touch that. Now somebody say, we're going to reduce Islamic education content somehow. I don't think anyone would be willing to touch that. Even though you could make maybe an argument that maybe you could reduce content, make it higher quality and this and that, but it's such a politically sensitive issue now. I don't think anybody would touch it. And so these policies are going to persist regarding of who wins the elections. And yeah, maybe you could say that if PAS wins majority in governance and the prime minister is from PAS, that they would push maybe for hudud laws and this and that, and but at the same time, that would just be a continuation of the policies that have started 40 years ago, and would not be something new. It would not be a radical change. People would say that would just be completing the circle that started a long time ago. So I already talked about this, obviously in 1980s, you have the Islamization drive by, by Dr. Mahathir Mohamad's led government. UMNO preemptively occupied Islamic governance space to outflank PAS. So there was always this notion that UMNO is not Islamic enough. And if you want to be a true Muslim, you have to vote for PAS. Some PAS leaders would go as far as to say, if you vote for PAS, you go to Jannah. If you don't, and all of that. But the reality is that UMNO became more and more Islamic over time. I mean, if you read about UMNO in the 60s and the 70s, it is a nationalist party and it's a Malay party, so obviously Islam is part of their identity. But you could argue that, I wouldn't say it wasn't central. It is central because Islam is a central part of Malay identity. But state policies were not necessarily aligned with what more Islamist actors were calling for or asking for. I mean, when Malaya became independent in 1957, I don't know when that changed, but I know, and I have read that, I mean, I don't know, I wasn't alive then, but I have read that in parliament, you could actually get alcohol. And that actually there were Malay parliamentarians who would go to parliament canteen and get alcoholic drinks. If somebody did that today, just imagine if a Malay parliamentarian is, ambigamba, you take photo of a person drinking alcoholic drinks anywhere, let alone inside the state institution, in the parliament, I think that would be the end of their career. That would be the end of that person. 60 years ago, it wasn't. So the state generally has become more Islamized and more Islamic. And the pressure that the Islamist actors were driving from outside the state institution has accelerated that. One could make an argument that state would become more Islamic over time, even if there were no Islamist actors. But you could not make an argument that the state would not be Islamic if there had been no Islamist actors. They were largely responsible for it. So actually, to a large extent, they got what they wanted, minus their direct access to political power. But policy-wise, and that is something that I think Olivier Roy or Capel or other authors, Asif Bayat, simply do not capture in their arguments. If you look at JACIM, JACIM was created in 1997. It was established. It manages halal certification, which is now, according to latest that I found, maybe it's inaccurate, but I found about 49 billion ringgit industry. It trains Islamic civil servants, and its annual budget is more than 1 billion ringgit. It's sustained across coalitions. Do you think that if UMNO comes to power next year, let's say, or whoever it is other than the current administration, that they would say, you know what, we are going now to drastically reduce JACIM's budget? No, I could even see that they would drastically increase it to show that you don't have to worry anything. We are Islamic, And so this outbidding, Islamic outbidding, has become a norm in Malaysia. Now, we could discuss to what extent is that good or bad, what are the downsides, what are the collaterals, and so on. That's a valid discussion. I'm focusing now just on this argument and trying to prove it by using case studies. And then, of course, you have Islamic university graduates. They come and populate state institutions. Now, one could argue, well, not all, maybe not even majority of Islamic university graduates are Islamists. That's true. But they are operating within that ecosystem now. And so there is a pressure on them to abide by policies that, again, initially were promulgated by the Islamists and that became part of normal politics today. And I think we are blessed that we here have people who have memories of Malaysia of many decades ago, and you could see I could see, I arrived here in 1994, and I could see over the years dramatic changes in Malaysia, not only in terms of economic development and infrastructure development. Sometimes when I come, I get lost because there are so many new highways. Back then there was Lebuh Persekutuan, and that was it. You go to Subang and you hit the traffic jam and you need 2 hours to get to Subang. Good luck, right? Now you have so many, I don't even know the names any longer, right? So there's been dramatic change in that. But I could also see dramatic change even at the grassroots level. I was just talking to somebody 2 days ago and saying that even back in the 90s, I would go to Kedah very often because my ex-wife was from there at that time. I could go to Kampong, and this was really like Kampong Melayu, like really, really. I could see transformation back then, and people becoming more aligned with past over time. What used to be UMNO stronghold is not anymore. And so when people tell me, we are so surprised, past has such, we have no inroads in these areas. I said, I saw it 20 years ago, 25 years ago. I'm not surprised, so you always have to know what's happening at the grassroots level. And even individually, people try to out-Islam each other, Oh, that's not Islamic enough. That's not how, why do you wear this? Why do you behave like that? Why do you eat like that? Why, and there is a lot of social pressure on that. And so when that social pressure is combined with political scene, you get what you get today, which is many of these things. Now, you could argue that Islamists did not call for all of that, and that is true. They did not, they probably had general policies. They didn't have very specific policies. They just knew they wanted more Islamic education. They wanted Islamic banking. They want more Islamic laws. And we had Islamization of laws, harmonization of, Sharia laws with common law and so on. All of that has taken place, so much so that the late Chief Justice, Abdul Hamid Mohammed, he said that 90% or more of the laws in common law are Sharia compliant. There's only like few that have remained outside of that. And the state has actually been the driver to make sure that this happens. Would they have done it had Islamists not been so, persistent in their demands? That remains to be seen. That's a counterfactual that you cannot really examine in real life. But what could be examined is what actually happened. And what actually happened was that under pressure from the Islamists, the state felt that it needed to Islamize its own administration, laws, banking, education, and so many other areas. Now let's take a look at Indonesia, and obviously Malaysia, being in Malaysia, it's much closer to us. We all know it probably much better on a day-to-day basis. But even if you look at Indonesia, that embedding happened in Indonesia, even though Indonesia is obviously a very different society, very different state, that sometimes people who look from the outside, they don't realize how different Malaysia and Indonesia actually are. But I would argue that embedded Islamism has been happening in Indonesia as well, in some similar ways, but also with some differences. So you have MUI, Majelis Ulama Indonesia, and religious authority. It was created in 1975. And then it was, in the beginning, it was created as a state tool to basically look at some policies or to legitimize government among the people. What has happened over time is that MUI has become a norm setter. So instead of being reactive in the sense of waiting for government to tell them, and then they would examine certain things and say, this is Islamic or this is not, they actually are now actively, through fatwa and other institutions, being able to actually set the agenda for the government and expectations so that the government feels pressure in the same way that Islamist actors here in Malaysia would put on the government. So you have, just like in Malaysia, you have halal economy. Indonesia was a little bit late compared to Malaysia in that, as you know, but now pretty much there is a new law that states that halal compliance is now a legal requirement across all consumer goods categories. Last time I checked, they said by October of this year, even makeup will have to be halal certified, so lipsticks and mascaras and all of those things that people like to use are going to be halal certified. And so even though Indonesia was a little bit late to that game compared to Malaysia, it's now catching up and it's pretty much becoming way. So it's one way for the government also to say, we are already doing it. There is no need to look at other political parties, right? And then in 2019, there was this pesantren law that integrated pesantrens, pesantren, Islamic boarding schools. It's like pondok in Indonesia. They are now formally accredited, and that gives more inroads for pesantren graduates to go into universities and eventually emerge. Now, again, the point is well taken if somebody says, but many of these pesantrens are not Islamists, and that's absolutely true. But many of the policies that eventually state institutions advocate are in line with the original Islamist preferences. And so whether intentionally or not, they become part of that game of embedded Islamism. So there is something I would call the reformasi paradox. So we had reformasi here in Malaysia, but Indonesia, they had it a little bit earlier. And I remember this very well because I was here at that time when this was happening in Indonesia, when Suharto was, kicked out, and then Indonesia again became democratic after 4 decades. You know, they had this guided democracy, what they call it, pimping, is it? Guided democracy and so on under Sukarno, then Suharto, and then became democratic again. But the state, because it needed legitimacy in that new era, accommodated rather than contested Islamist policies. So even though in Indonesia you will hear this much more explicitly, where both the government and some of the Islamic movements, especially NU, Nahdlatul Ulama, are very strongly anti-Islamist in their rhetoric. In reality, they have actually accommodated many of these policies. So they are explicitly anti-Islamists. They say that this has no place in Indonesia, and so on. At the same time, they're accommodating Islamist policies in state institutions. And that's the paradox that I highlighted. And so I think I already talked about this. This is just sort of explanation of the previous slide, together with some timeline and so on. And so even though it worked in a quite different way than in Malaysia, the outcome when it comes to embedded Islamism is very similar. So much so that now under Prabowo, you have both NU and Muhammadiyah affiliated parties part of the government. Remember the Jokowi, the previous president, he was very much pro-NU, and Muhammadiyah wasn't really part of that. And Prabowo said, you know what, why not bring both on board? And so, you know what they say in politics, keep your friends close, but enemies closer. If they are here with me, I know exactly what they're trying to do. And I'm not saying that they're enemies from Prabowo points of view, but definitely they could be disrupting agents. And so he brought them on board. And so what do you think is going to happen? What's going to happen is that both NU and Muhammadiyah are going to try to push for more Islam-oriented policies. Now, you could say again, but that's not the same as Islamism. It's not. The thing is that many of those policies were the policies that were initially and in the first place advocated by Islam. And so Islamism has embedded itself even among non-Islamist actors. So if we try to do a quick comparative analysis across different dimensions, we'll find that there are differences between Malaysia and Indonesia, and that the nature of the embedded Islamism may be different in two countries. I haven't explored that because that would probably be a follow-up thing. So in terms of bureaucratic depth, in Malaysia, it's more centralized. The federal government has much more, even though, of course, the administration of Islamic affairs is often done at the state level and under the purview of sultans in different states. Still, the federal government drives much of that process, and Jakim has an outsized authority in that. Indonesia, it is much more dispersed, but still you get very similar outcome. The electoral driver is competition with PAS, whether it be UMNO or Pakatan or some other coalition that may emerge in future. There is that competition that actually leads and facilitates the embedding of Islamist norms. A civil society in Malaysia is weaker compared to Indonesia. State has a controlling voice when it comes to it, whereas in Indonesia, civil society is much stronger. You have NU and Muhammadiyah, but not only them, you have many other institutions, but these two are, of course, best known. And then I think I want to focus on the last dimension, which is reversibility. And this is what I've been saying all along. What do you think is the potential for reversibility of these policies? I would say in Malaysia, it's very low. Nobody would want to touch that thing now and say we need less Islam in the government. You know, people sometimes advocate it. Maybe you find a blog somebody is writing in some alternative media and whatnot. But do you imagine a mainstream politician especially somebody from a ruling coalition or party, whether now or in the future, coming out and saying we need less Islam somehow in the government.
To be political suicide.
Suicide, exactly. So I think it's very low reversibility. In Indonesia, the chance is maybe slightly higher for those who would like to reverse those policies, but I think even in Indonesia, it has become path dependent. You know, once you start walking on that path, it becomes very hard to go back to previous stations on that path. And so there is a shared logic here between Malaysia and Indonesia. You have ratchet effect, something the economists call ratchet effect, and that is, you know, once you start, it's kind of like path dependency in a way. Once you start walking a certain path, then the logic becomes necessitated upon you, whether you like it or not. You know, whether some individual politician really likes those policies or not is really irrelevant. They have to do it because they need popular support, they need legitimacy. There is elite outbidding, so there's constantly, we are more Islamic. No, we are more Islamic. No, you are less Islamic. See what they're doing, you know. This outbidding is constantly happening, and when outbidding happens, the bar constantly rises. So in order to be more Islamic, you have to say, oh, now we're going to do this. And the other side is going to, no, we have to also do this. No, I'll do it. And then the bar just keeps rising and rising, and outbidding leads to greater institutionalization of these policies. And then there is generational reproduction through state education, because Islam is a big part of education from elementary school. You could say from Tadika and Tasca and, you know, even preschool, but then through elementary and sekolah menengah and all the way to university, it becomes basically reproduced across generations. You could even almost remove Islamists now from political space. There is already a self-reinforcing mechanism in place that is going to generationally reproduce those policies. So if now we kind of take a step back after these case studies, what are some of the conditions for embedding? And I argue that there are three conditions that produce and sustain embedded Islamism. First one is state dominance. That strong administrative capacity enables the institutionalization of Islamic norms. So you could make an argument that somewhere where there is a weak state, you couldn't have this, you know, which allows, for instance, for people in comparative politics to look at different countries and make comparisons across the board and see why in some countries it's more likely that you would have embedded Islamism compared to others. But definitely Malaysia has a very strong institutional capacity, the state has. And for that reason, these embedded Islamist policies become even more reproduced within the state. You have elite competition, Muslim majority electoral environments create incentives for non-Islamist elites to govern through Islamic frameworks to avoid appearing insufficiently Islamic, right? So, and then finally, you have this generational reproduction. So these conditions explain why embedding occurs even when Islamist parties do not govern. And I am quickly coming to the end of my presentation, and I do want to acknowledge certain implications and limitations of this argument. So the implications are, I think, quite clear now after this presentation, including that the standard toolkit that people use to evaluate Islamists, which is party system, constitutional provisions, and so on, are insufficient. One must look inside the state. And I think this is what made those earlier generations of people who studied Islamists make arguments that they made, which I found problematic, is that they assumed that just because Islamists are not leading the state, there is nothing in the state to look at to try to determine whether Islamist policies were implemented or not. And embedded Islamism allows us to look into the state even when Islamists do not govern. Democratic quality assessments, you know, like different measurements of democratic indicators, and there are many of those, systematically understate Islamic governance when it is institutionalized rather than electoral. Like even if you look at the World Bank has these indices of governance, and I often use it when I teach, and they have 6 of these indices, indices being plural of index. And, they don't look at Islamic governance. And so if you just look at that, you would assume that Islam almost has no role in governance. And you could go online and look for indices of governance and look Malaysia and Indonesia, and you would not assume that these are Muslim states in any way. And so maybe this also calls for research institutions in Muslim countries, and especially Malaysia and Indonesia, to create these indices of Muslim governance, which would allow us to measure this better and have better analytical insight into what is going on. So Southeast Asia's moderate Islam, and this is from the point of view of somebody looking from the outside, they would say that Islam is moderate when it doesn't govern. Islam is moderate when it doesn't have to do anything with politics and so on and so forth. And so, and Southeast Asia is usually presented in Western. I'm looking specifically talking about the Western studies of Islam in Southeast Asia. They would look at Malaysia and Indonesia as places for moderate Islam, unlike, those crazy Middle Easterners. Actually, I would argue that Malaysia and Indonesian states are more Islamic than almost any state in the Middle East and the Arab. But what is also interesting about Malaysia and Indonesia is that they're also democratic states. They're not liberal democracies, and we now know that liberal democracy has huge problems, even in its places of origin. Look at in Europe and especially the United States, But Malaysia and Indonesia have found a way to work with democracy and Islam in ways that create overall, I would say, relatively good governance combined with economic development and other things. I mean, no one can argue that economically speaking, life here today is not better than it was 30 or 40 years ago, or in Indonesia. And this has happened together with the rise of political Islam and together with the embedding of Islamist policies within the government, which goes completely against the secularization thesis in politics, which says that, the more developed countries become, the less religious they'll come. We know now that this thesis has been disproven time and again. But back in the 80s and the 90s, there was still a lot of questions about that. I remember when I was a student here, then at ISTAC, and we looked into this, the Western social scientists had a really hard time understanding how could it be that Malaysia is an Asian tiger, a country that's, remember at that time, what was 8 to 10% on an annual basis economic growth? And yet at the same time, Islam is assuming more and more role in politics. This shouldn't happen according to their theories. And yet it did happen. And so Malaysia and Indonesia are really interesting case studies. And I don't think I would be able to understand this embedded Islamism if I only looked into the Middle East, which I think is the problem with many of the people who are writing about Islamism. I think Malaysia and Indonesia give us much richer, much more nuanced understanding what's happening when Islam, state institutions, Islamist opposition, and all of the different things and democracy are put together. The outcome may not please everybody, but from a political scientist point of view, it's extremely exciting because it's so new and so different, and there is so much to look into. So now, I want to talk about limitations. We always have to admit that whatever study we do. So causal attribution. Is embedding happening because of elite electoral incentives or because of Islamist agency? And that's not always easy to disentangle. And that will require maybe more work, more look into this. Normative framing also has limitations because we might risk reproducing secularist assumption that religion in the state is anomalous. If we just say that this is only happening in Malaysia, Indonesia, so it could be an anomaly and not some sort of regular rule. And then, of course, this is only based on 2 case studies. You have 57 majority Muslim nations. Would that translate across the spectrum? And just thinking about it, I think it would not in most of the cases, because I think one of the preconditions for embedded Islamism is democracy, actually. And you don't have that in most Muslim majority nations. So democracy actually, in my opinion, facilitates embedded Islamism, not the other way around. So what is the implication for governance and for democracy? I think that Malaysia and Indonesia show that Islamic values, democratic participation, effective governance can reinforce, not undermine one another. I mean, just look at, for instance, halal certification policy. You can look at it from the point of view of, there's been a pressure and it's a political issue. But if you just look from governance, it's an extremely well-governed sector. I know that because I'm also partly involved in the United States with halal certification, and I can tell you that halal certification sector is extremely well governed. They put all of these different safeguards to make sure that people do not cheat, because people take this very seriously. So if somebody puts halal stamp on something, you want to make sure that they did everything they were supposed to do. And so governance actually so I would argue that these policies have actually improved governance in many sectors in Malaysia. The same goes for Islamic banking and finance. Because of so much pressure to make sure that this is truly Islamic, it truly abides by the mandates of fiqh and sharia and Islamic banking in general. If you look at the regulatory policies of central bank, Bank Negara, on Islamic banking, it's very serious stuff. So you could argue that these Islamic policies have actually made the state better governed in many areas. And this is something that is often overlooked when people talk about these things. So you find a connection between Islamist or Islamic policies, what was Islamist is now Islamic policy, and good governance, because of the pressure to abide by certain regulatory rules to make sure that when we say that this stamp is on the food, we are 100% sure that it's dijamin halal, right? Because that's what people expect. And there is so much pressure, and we hear every now and then that sometimes when it's discovered that some company was using halal logo but did not really abide by those principles, there is a huge outcry. And most of the time, that company will have, people start going to avoid that company and this and that. So people take this very seriously. So one could argue then that embedded Islamism has improved both democracy and good governance in these countries. One could argue it's debatable, maybe on the first part, because it all depends on what concept of democracy someone has. But on the issue of good governance, I think it would be harder to argue against that. So embedded Islamism has improved governance across the spectrum. And so you have democratic resilience. In spite of government changes, both in Malaysia and Indonesia, and by the way, both Malaysia and Indonesia have passed the test of consolidated democracy, which happens when you have one party or coalition that has been in power losing elections, and you have a peaceful transfer of power. See what happened in the United States, January 6th, when Trump didn't want to, accept the elections, you had violence. But in Malaysia, when UMNO lost and Pakatan won, there was no violence. Yeah, there was debate, there was discussion, people are running to see the Sultan and trying to, that's politics. But on the streets, nobody felt, oh, we should go out and now demonstrate because and burn and loot because one party lost or the other won. And that wasn't always the case. Remember May 13, 1969? That wasn't always the case. But now it seems that democracy has matured. The same thing happened in Indonesia. You have change from one party to another. And yet it's a peaceful transfer of power. I cannot overstate how important this is. And so when people say, yeah, Malaysia, Indonesia, they are not truly democratic. I would say, what standards are you using? If you look at it from liberal democracy point of view, they are not liberal. But can democracy be disentangled from liberalism? And what does that mean? I would say that they are Muslim democracies. I wouldn't call them Islamic, Muslim democracies. They are Muslim majority countries, and Islam plays an important role in these two countries in the way that people understand politics, that they govern, that they do day-to-day business, because democracy is not just about elections. It's also about governance. It's all about day-to-day thing. And if you look at that, it functions really well in these two countries. I mean, it functions really well. I mean, I go out in the street in Malaysia or Indonesia, I never think about my personal safety. I cannot feel that, even though I've been living in the United States 25 years, when I go out, I always look around. Well, I don't know what's going to happen, especially if it's late at night. And I can't imagine how it feels for, for women, for instance, to walk at 10 p.m. But I see here, I go out and I see women walking alone at 11 p.m. in streets of KL. Try to do that in New York City, in Washington, D.C. You're not going to see that. So, when we talk about democracy and governance, there are so many different layers we can talk about. And I think this embedded Islamism kind of draws attention to governance and so on. So, embedded Islamism is not democracy's rival in Southeast Asia. It has become part of democracy's fabric. That's that sentence at the bottom. That, I think, is quite amazing. Nobody expected that. And so to conclude, I would say that political Islam in Southeast Asia is not fading, contrary to the expectations of Roa and Keppel and, Asif Bayat. It's actually embedding, and that embedding is an ongoing process. It's sustained by institutional self-reinforcement, generational reproduction. Embedding does not require Islamic parties to govern. Non-Islamist elites drive it too. And once embedded, Islamic institutional authority is highly resistant to reversal. This is what we call the ratchet effect. And so to conclude, the revolution did not come, but the state quietly and incrementally became Islamic anyway. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to our
Thank you very much, Dr. Ermin Sinanović, for the insightful and fascinating lecture on embedded Islamism. If I might add, in a way, Dr. Ermin is actually a product of embedded Islamism in Malaysia. Because I failed to mention that Dr. Ermin is a graduate from IIUM for his bachelor's and master's degrees before pursuing his PhD in the US. And that explains why he's fluent in Malay. Nevertheless, I find it intriguing and in a way wonder about how Islamists might view this concept of embedded Islamism, because as you mentioned, ironically, it is a product and a part of their political ambitions and goals, but they are not required to govern. So I think power is quite important. I think so. Power is quite important. Perhaps if they are sincere, ikhlas, it's okay. I don't know. But I leave the questions for the audience. We have a lot of distinguished and familiar faces. So I think it's now time for Q&A. But before that, I would like to remind you to at least introduce your name and your affiliations and try to keep it brief. But we have a lot of time, I think about 40 minutes. So I see Dr. Latif here. Any more hands? Ghazali? The second? Oh no, not the second, Dr. Ghazali. Okay, and gentleman over there. All right, I think I will get three first. Dr. Latif, maybe if you can begin.
Thank you, Naim, for your name. Thank you very much for your very exciting and very, I don't know whether you call it groundbreaking, because it is something. It is. But some observations, Dr. Ermin, when you were speaking about Malaysian Islam in Malaysia as a whole, I think going back into the historical perspective, you would have heard of the revival of Islam in Malaysia. I mean, it was a global thing. It was with Ikhwan and all these things. I think, so that's where the term Islamist comes about, with the ideals of Islam or let's just say Islam coming back in a position of ruling, not in a position of being ruled. So this concept was put forward. Now, in Malaysia, of course, you cannot deny that at one time, PAS, for example, PAS is a political party, but PAS itself had two phases. It is not. It was not. It was not a homogeneous kind of ideological trajectory all through right to this day. At one time, of course, it was nationalistic, more towards nationalism and Malay, and. But as it developed, when it came to the early 80s, or rather late 70s, it became very radical and revolutionary, and it was more, let's say, ideologically following, say, the teachings of Said Hawa. You might have heard of batas. Huh?
Even Khomeini, the whole concept of ulama being at the top,
Yes, ulama. That's the leadership of the ulama and things like that.
Oh yeah.
But even with the leadership of the ulama, you had the type of ulama, for example, Fadil Noor and Nick Aziz, who are not, I think, different from the type of Hadi Awang's kind of thinking, which is totally different. So when you get this kind of thing, and you could find that the notion of Islamic governance as envisaged by, say, Fadil Noor is not the same as what Hadi Awang was at that time. But of course, there were politics, too much of politicking, and power was more the driving force rather than Islam itself. I do not know which is which. Today, I can't say whether it's going to be more going towards Islam, or is it just power itself, or as a tool, as is happening all over the world. You can see it in India, BJP, which is, I think, is using in Hinduism just to come into power, and of course, it has to do this and that. I mean, to oppress and the other religious minorities, to show that it is more Hindu than everyone else. So this kind of a situation, I do not know how you would describe this in the context of Islamism and post-Islamism. So today's condition, when you look at the Muslim, I mean, in Malaysia, for example, what the Prime Minister is doing now with Malaysia Madani. Now, the Madani concept itself is already the Islam embedded, which Islamism embedded in a much more wider scale, where he talks about the values and civilization of Islam. I mean, which is, I think, the final destination of Islamist movements. What is your comment on this?
One by one, because it's so you don't have recency bias,
Recency bias.
Yeah. No, that's a great observation, and I agree with you. In the sense, past of the 1960s, and of course, Farish Noor has amazing study on the past. Of course, it ends in early 2000s, but still shows the transformation that the past has gone through. But on the last point, I think you're absolutely right that this may be one of the final stops, and maybe it is, the circle completing itself, because obviously in the 1970s, Anwar Ibrahim was one of the leading voices of Islamic movement, and the Islamization policies of the 1980s were intensified after he was co-opted into the Mahathir's government, right? Many people believed that he would go to PAS. He ended up in UMNO, and we know the rest of the story. But then if you go back, this is exactly, and this is my problem with Asif Bayat and others talking about post-Islamism. I don't think they know Islamist literature that well. I don't think they understand the philosophy of what came to be known as Islamism that well. Because if you look back, even 1940s, 1950s, even Hassan al-Banna himself, but later on Sayyid Qutb and many others, have written about Islam as a civilizational project. That Islam is not just about capturing the state and governing and this and that. That was just a tool to achieve larger goals, which is to reestablish Islam as a civilization. And you know, if you go back to books like Sayyid Qutb's on التصور الإسلامي, you know, it's translated into English as Islamic concept, or you could say Islamic worldview, and he talks about values like waqi'iyya, reality, alamiyya, you know, it's global, and so on and so forth. It's a global outlook as a at a civilizational level. And so I think many of the people who study Islamism, they really don't understand a lot of the philosophy behind Islamism because they focus too much on just politics. And for Islamist, politics is just one part of what they were doing. Like, for instance, one thing they never focus about spiritual, they think that Islamist movement do not have spiritual component to it. Well, any surah in Malaysia has al-Ma'thurat. And who is the author of al-Ma'thurat? Hassan al-Banna. And what are al-Ma'thurat? Al-Ma'thurat are Shadhili, Sufi, awrad that you do in the morning and the evening, adhkar. But they don't know that because they don't study this movement. They don't know the practice of these movements. And so for me, that's why they got so many things wrong. But for us living in Muslim societies, I think we can understand it better because you meet these people on a daily basis. You know, I remember we were at IIM, we were reciting al-Ma'thurat. I didn't know what al-Ma'thurat was. And then, oh, this is Hassan al-Banna. So this is Islamic movement. Where did this come from? It came from the Sufis, from the Shadhilis. How do you make sense of that? For Muslims, it's not too difficult. But for somebody looking from the outside, they already had their pre-established categories. So Sufism and Islamism are opposed to one another. There's no way you can have both. They don't understand, I think, oftentimes. And for Muslims, they see all part of the same ecosystem of Islam. You know, you can have your politics, but you can also have your Sufi practices, and you can have your this and that. And we don't see necessarily that as opposed to one another. So these binary oppositions that we constantly find in Western thinking, I think Naqib al-Atas, rahmatullahi alayh, Allah yarhamu, he used to talk, I studied with him, so I know he used to talk about that the Western mind operates in this binary oppositional kind of way. It's either religious or secular. It is, and for us, we don't see those separation as such. And that's why I think we move through life much easier. You know, you go to a mosque, then you go do what could be seen as a secular, you know, kind of, and we don't see the contradiction between, because again, that's all part of a larger ecosystem. So, so that's, I think, where it comes to that. I think this is where probably Anwar Ibrahim is coming from with the concept of Medani, is now elevating that whole thing to a civilizational level, trying to tell people this is about good governance, about compassion, about pluralism. And this is all part of Islam. And again, if you go back, Asif Bayat and Olivier Roa, they write that this is a sign of the decline of Islamism. But if you go back to the philosophy of Islamist leaders, you'll find that pluralism was always part of what they were preaching. They say this is part of Islam. So again, for us, it's easier to understand. I think for people from outside the tradition, it's much harder because the concepts they are using, I think, are created in such a way that kind of escapes or defies easy understanding, or makes them sometimes incapable of fully grasping what's going on. So yeah, I would agree with you on that. And that's a very good point. Thank you.
Yes, I think before we continue to the next one, I think the question whether Madani project will be considered embedded Islam is whether it leaves a mark, leaves a sediment, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe you just answer that with the next question. Dato' Ghazali?
Thank you. Currently, I was in government. I also work in the Islamic Development Bank for 13 years. And currently, I'm the Secretary General of the World Zakat Wakaf Forum. So my question to you, sir, is more civilizational context.
Mm-hmm.
What you're looking today at the geopolitical development, it is not this happened today, have a history, happened in 1973. The rise of the Islamic Development Bank it was an economic rise against the attempt to do what they did to Iran in 1950. That have not been mentioned. It is historical fact. And today, development is happening in that region, and the rise of multipolar countries, BRICS, is give a different twist to our argument. So technically, since Second World War, the dominance of the Anglo-Saxon worldview of development has been, till today, not tested. Right? And the Muslims today have realized that they have not had that civilizational education in their life for the last 500 years of Western politics. It happened here, when we saw the rise of world-class thinking, which you just mentioned the name, that could bring the seminal book, Secularism and Islam. That was a contemporary answer to the Western dominance of how nations are being managed, created, and survive. Now, the Muslims have an opportunity to realize that development of the World Bank is a secular concept, whereas Islam is not a secular concept. It's a civilizational, a comprehensive system. Now, that challenges every faith member of that religion, of that faith, actually. I use the word religion. We put him back in the same narrative of one. So today, when you talk about embedded Islam, is a way, especially in the Malay world, we are not similar to the Arab world. We know their history, and we know our history, how Islam came here. The psyche of the people are different. We are not very, what they call rebellious generation. We knew about Sufism is part of our life, even though our new generation lost it anyway, right? But my question to you, sir, is the global geopolitical crisis we have is an opportunity for us to answer two things. The excessive unbridled capitalism in the West makes all the third world countries realize we are no longer going to be prudent to them. And therefore, Islam, with its more equitable economic system that does not go on race or region, will have an answer. That's how the rise of Islamic banking and how we are now promoting Waqf as the savior of 10 civilizations in world history. For a fact, that was disbanded by them for obvious reasons, because that was the source, the economic system for the arrival of capitalism in the rest of the world. My question to you, sir, is that you may want to add a different, beside the three dynamics, not bureaucracy, whatnot, more civilization. Because that is very important. Because if today you can see China talking to Greece about Eastern civilization and the Greek civilization, where is Islam? The fact you mentioned World Bank never recognized Islam, we will understand why. Because where do they bring development? Is a political economic system of their choice. And we have been ruled today. But now today, the Muslims world, their money are all over. Not they don't have money. But like in Malaysia, for that matter, I would put a matter of contention. The Malay world is the lasting current model of Islam manifests itself into a new civilization model the next century. Because we don't have wars, so we have people attempt to make us irrelevant in terms of democracy and all that, right? We understand that. But my point to you and the rest in the hall is that where do we take this the what I call divine opportunity? This does not depend, as a matter of our cost. We have a divine opportunity, and therefore the challenge is to rise, because we were given so much in the last 6-7 years of goodness and goodwill, and to rise up to the occasion to give an answer to the world that Islam has civilization has not embedded. It is part of the subterranean psyche of the people of the Malay world that have been eroded for reasons you understand, but now it's coming up. That's why the Malay Muslim world is different from other world, whether in Africa, whether in Middle East, whether in China. But we have got back what we use the word, we have received our political power back. And we did it right in the sense that continuous and we have no problem of. We like Indonesia is different, but Malaysia's history, the people are wiser. And they embedded political power in the constitution. Until today, it is some sort as a covenant, not a contract. Many of us use the word social contract. That is the European history. For us, no. The covenant, as far as Malaysia is concerned, is linked to the spiritual basis how we run the country. And therefore, when you talk about values, it cannot be quote unquote value driven. It has to be more divine led nation. And it can accommodate any religion because we don't want to convert people. But if a country is led by what we call spiritual framework, that will ensure justice for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doctor, for this wonderful comment and questions. And I fully agree with you. I think yesterday we were at ISTAC and then we were having some conversations after my talk, and we specifically talked about this, that this is a time opportunity. I think it's no coincidence that, for instance, the Prime Minister is today in Japan, right? Because there is this feeling that the gravity of power is shifting toward Asia, or has already shifted. And I think this is a great opportunity for Muslim countries in Asia, Malaysia, Indonesia, but others too, to reassert what we believe should be a civilizational order based on divine values. And I think fully agree that this is really opportunity and a task for the next generation. And I agree with you that what I called here embedded Islamism is really just a restoration, bringing back Islamic governance, bringing back, from 1511, which is usually taken as the day that, Malacca fell to 1957, when Malaya was established, 446 years, 4.5 centuries of colonial rule, Portuguese, Dutch, British, and yet you have the maintenance of these values throughout. Even though Muslims were not in power, they maintained those values. So once they regained their own self-independence and sufficiency, we're now seeing. So I see it as a bigger picture together with you. This is, of course, a micro case study, but the bigger picture is Muslims reasserting, reacquiring what they used to have, what was interrupted by 4 to 5 centuries of colonialism. And even during those 4.5 centuries of foreign rule in these lands, Muslims knew what they wanted. Muslims retained those values and then came back in modern times. I think that story needs to be told in a much better fashion than we usually are telling, because I think it's a quite amazing story. Every time I teach about Islam in Southeast Asia, I point to my students that it's so amazing that these countries have been under foreign control between 350 to 450 years. And Islam not only was maintained, it actually went from strength to strength during the even colonial period. So the resilience of Muslims in Malaysia, what became Malaysia and Indonesia, because these are new states. Indonesia didn't exist. I mean, there were Dutch Indies, and you could make argument that it was Dutch who created Indonesia, because there would be no Indonesia without the Dutch. But still, is a tremendous, amazing story. And Muslims are now finally reasserting their own vision of governance and so on, and coming to the point to connect both of these comments now to reasserting now civilizational values, because you needed some basis on which you needed to build that. Now that Islamic governance is present in both of these countries in various degrees, it's time to say, okay, now let's look more at civilization. I think that's why you see outreach in both Malaysia and Indonesia toward China, toward Japan, toward other countries in Asia, because we realize this is not just an Islamic thing. This is a more universal thing. And like you said, within that pluralism, everyone can find space under that umbrella. And so that's, I think, quite amazing, quite useful. So thank you so much for your comment and question.
And we have the third question.
My name is Aloysius Francis Pinto. I come from a Chinese Portuguese background, and I'm very proud of my Singapore education. As a non-Islamic elite, I'm very encouraged by this presentation because I wrote a document sometime back in 2008 when I was a political secretary for Subang Parliament. I'm no more a politician. I'm still a PKR member. And I believe I put this statement, it's time for concerned citizens to rise up to the occasion to fill in the gap that Malaysia is in transition from a previous government that purely based on cronyism to a new government that wants to work on meritocracy. Civil society must rise up to the challenge. And your presentation is a very good example of how civil society is responding in a positive way. And after going through all your presentation, I'm very encouraged. I'm very encouraged because I'm a Roman Catholic, okay? Pope Leo is my leader, okay? And I'm very encouraged in the sense that values are values. And I only hope that Donald Trump behaves like a Christian. I only hope that he will behave like a Christian because he has a Christian name, but he's killing people in Palestine is not a Christian thing. And Pope Leo spoke very strongly.
Christians in Palestine.
Yeah.
Only killing Christians in Palestine.
So, like I said, as a non-Islamic elite, I'm very encouraged that your presentation because I'm living in the right place. I've got a birth certificate that says I'm a British subject because I was born in Singapore. My parents are from Portugal and China, but I tell you very frankly, I will never give up my Malaysian citizenship because, the very simple statement I just told Ghazali, I said, where in the world can you throw out a 62-year-old government and you pergi kedai mama, aman dan damai. 18 months later, we throw out another government, but it's still a very peaceful country. So I believe that sometime back when Professor Khoo Kek Kim and his friends came up with the Rukun Negara after May 69, I went and meet him actually before he died, and he explained to me why the Rukun Negara. I said, I advised Wan Aziza at that time, she was Deputy Prime Minister. I said, because I was a political secretary, I said, you need to go back to the Rukun Negara. And I believe till today, I'm heading that movement because Rukun Negara very clearly states that the first principle, kepercayaan kepada Tuhan. I'm very proud that your presentation here as a Muslim, you have shown me as a non-Muslim Islamic elite that I'm in the right country because you're practicing democracy the way your values, which is very consistent with what my belief system is also. And I really want to thank you for this wonderful presentation.
Doctor, I think that's more like a praise.
Well, I do have
kudos rather than.
Yeah.
I think I would allow to comment, but I think if I can get a raise of hand, can I get?
May I just?
Okay, yes, please.
Okay, yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for your comments. It's very touching, and I share your outlook. You'd be encouraged to know that where I work, which is Center for Islam in the Contemporary World, and we are based at Shenandoah University in Virginia, we're actually working on a seminar that we're going to be doing in October of the dialogue between some leading Muslim and Catholic theologians and activists in the United States talking about issues of social justice and shared values. And we have already gotten acceptance from some leading Muslim and Catholic activists in the United States who will be coming to that, because this is very much part of what we believe in, is that the values that we propagate are values for all humanity, and that ultimately we share so much more than what divides us. And so in order to use this opportunity to make a better future and a new multipolar world in which I think Asia is going to play a much bigger role, I think we have so much to offer together to make that world better. So thank you again for your comments.
We have about 15 minutes more. So I think to compress the question, if I may. Yeah. So, okay. Even though it will fall into the recency bias. Huh? It's okay. Yeah? So I see Dr. Farouk, the first hand, second one, gentleman, and the third one. Okay. Please, begin with you.
Assalamualaikum. Dr. Farouk, Islamic Fund, I think you know me. Yeah, my question is that, I think your talk would be better if you start first by giving a definition of what you meant by Islamism. Because to me, after listening to your talk, I believe that it is not so much of Islamism, from my understanding, more of institutionalization of Islam in this country and probably in Malaysia as well. Because you see, to me, Islamism itself, of course, I won't talk about post-Islamism. Naim knows that, I wrote a lot about post-Islamism. But what I'm saying that Islamism, the first criteria of Islamism is the concept of what Said Qutb mentioned in his Ma'alif al-Tariq, the concept of Hakimiyah. So, if we have that, then we can say that it's Islamism. Otherwise, that I think the topic should be modified a little bit, in my opinion. Right? It cannot be said to be Islamism. And it cannot be said that, you mentioned correctly that they were trying, these political parties trying to out-Islamize each other, and that led to this situation that we're having now. It is good, right? Nothing bad about it. But the idea is to use the word Islamism, to me, is a little bit radical in a way, because even though I believe that doesn't basically really shift from the concept of Islamism to post-Islamism, yet even in this country, but more importantly is the institutionalization of Islam. And the issue, like you mentioned correctly about Jakim, for example, there's an example of institutionalization of Islam. And there is a problem with this idea of institutionalization of Islam, because they're trying to, what they call, silence any dissenting views. So they would just want one concept of Islam, and that's their Jakim Islam. And that's a problem when they're trying to silence dissenting views. And you've seen this in this country. At least so you see, and you wrote where you mentioned about, for example, Asia as well. So, there are problems that I think you have to raise about this issue as well.
Thank you. Assalamualaikum. My name is Said Akbar. I was there in 1993 when we started Islamic banking.
I think I received your newsletter.
My what?
Newsletter? You have?
No, sir, I don't have it. Somebody else. But 93 Islamic banking we went out through all the commercial banks other than Bank Islam. So I was there. Islamic banking has been developed since then. There were a lot of ups and downs, many things. My question to you is very simple. The second point first, embedding Islam in society, in state administration. We must be able to measure outcome. We must be able to measure what was the effect on people, the ummah, as well as general public, before and after, and unique from the already existing conventional or existing system. In other words, how is embedding Islam in administration, the changes. So we must be able to measure it uniquely from the existing systems that we have. So this is a point that I hope you can touch on. The second one is about Dr. Mahathir's political play or ploy with PAS to outdo each other in Islam. The question is, so how serious were they? Was it just a political game? Or were they, both of them, were they really interested in establishing Islamic value systems? Because what was the intention would have affected how sincere they were in doing what they did. That's my point. Thank you.
Yes. That's right.
My name is Abdul Wahab. I am from the NGO ADAP. Same with the Datuk Ghazali and Datuk Ghazali. My question is, I'm very impressed with the explanation that you give to us about embedded Islamism in Southeast Asia. My question is about the future. If in Indonesia, Islam is already embedded, is it possible that Indonesia will have another Muslim leader like Gus Dur in the name of Dr. Anies Baswedan? Do you think the prospect is better for Indonesia to have another Muslim leader from civilian background, not from the military like Prabowo? Thank you.
So we will have to disagree. Let me just immediately say that, because for instance, when you talk about Islamism and Hakimiyya being the deciding kind of factor, well, you know that even within Islamism you have different trends, and one could argue that when you talk about Hakimiyya, you know, in Malaysia you have Article 4, right, which states that Islam is the official religion of the federation. That is, you know, one could make an argument. I'm not saying that people are making that argument or that Islamists would agree that this is what they really want, but one could argue. So you could have interpretations there. So I still would very much go with my own term here, embedded Islamism. Post-Islamism, maybe we could discuss at some other time, but I indicated some ways in which I think that thesis is weak. And that's as much as I can say. I just want to finish all the questions and we can have the conversation, inshallah. For Sayyid Akbar, Mahathir is still alive, so if somebody wants to know if he was really sincere, they could ask him. I don't know, and I can't comment on someone's sincerity. I mean, I question my own sometimes, so how can I know if someone else is sincere or not? But to what extent it was just pure politics, and to what extent was a real drive to Islamize? I know that there are different opinions about that, and in my research, I have found that I don't think I can say whether he was sincere or not, whether he was sincerely trying to make country more Islamic. But I think he knew once he agreed to these Islamization policies where it would lead. And he was willing to live with that. Now, whether he was willing to live with that because he sincerely believed in those or because he thought that he could politically manage it, you can analyze it, you can ask him, you can, and even when you ask somebody, do they really give you 100% what they truly believe? It's very hard to know. But that's how I would look at it. But I think he knew what he was getting into. Once he invited Anwar to join the government, and once they decided to start the Islamization policies, there's a lot of things you can say about Mahathir, what he is and what he is not. There is one thing you cannot say. You cannot say that he is not very intelligent. He is very intelligent, very smart. And he knew where it would lead, and he could anticipate. Now, there are always unintended consequences that, even the most intelligent people cannot fully appreciate. But I think he knew where it would lead the country, and I think he was comfortable with that, because he felt, at least at that time, that he could manage it politically. And he did for quite some time, until 98, and then the whole Reformasi and everything else and whatever happened later on. And even Reformasi wasn't enough. It took really one MDB and kleptocracy, really, of unprecedented proportions, to people say, finally, enough is enough. And that was barely enough was enough, So, but when it comes to Mahathir, I can't really comment, but I think he knew where it would lead, because it's very, very smart. You can criticize him for many things, but you cannot say that he's not very intelligent. He is, and everybody knows that, And finally, the question was about
The future. Yeah.
the Indonesia. Yeah, I mean, I would agree with you from the bat off, immediately that.
Doctor, measuring outcome.
Oh yeah,
How do you measure?
it's so hard. Any social scientist would say that the hardest thing is about using measuring in social sciences, and especially about things that have happened in the past that you can't really have immediate access to. You can only have documentary evidence. But what you can do, and this is what I said earlier, is set some parameters for Islamic governance, what constitutes Islamic good governance, and then measure the outcomes, policy outcomes, government policy outcomes against those standards. So at least that would be one way to look at that. And I think we could do that. And I think it's high time that we in Malaysia and Indonesia have those kind of indicators so that we can measure good governance from an Islamic point of view, which, I think Imam Faisal Abdul Rauf, whose father used to be IIUM rector and who is Imam in New York, he actually had a book called Measuring Islamic State. But it's a good step, but I think that could be much, much more refined in order to come to the point where you could have some institution developing these kind of indicators. But I think it needs to be done. And that, I fully agree with you, that needs to be done. But how to do it, it will require institutional support, bring some really good social science researchers and people from different sectors, and then developing those indicators and then doing maybe annual index, which will show us whether the government is doing better or not, and we could hold them accountable to that, because that's what you do in democracy, right? About Indonesia, I agree with you immediately that it would be better for Indonesia to have a civilian president, not a former, military officer who has very checkered history, to say the least, about Prabowo. I hope he's not watching, because I do plan to go to Indonesia at some point. He is. Oh. Okay.
So make sure to not tell him. Huh?
Yeah. Yes, I met Anis Baswedan some 15 years ago. He did his PhD in the United States and wrote one of the best papers that is well referenced in literature on the evolution of Islamic political parties in Indonesia. So he's somebody who knows, his history and everything. And obviously issues surrounding elections for Jakarta, mayor and so on, and all of that. But yes, I think Indonesia always does better when it separates from itself from military. During Suharto time, there was a dwi-fungsi, right? That military has dual function, both military and civilian. Reformasi was against that. And now we see that it's coming back again. So I think for Indonesian democracy and Islam would be healthier if they kept them at bay. So I do hope that at some point they'll be able to come up with a leader that would not have that kind of a background.
Yeah, of course. We have a couple of minutes. Yeah.
My name is Ghazali Yusuf. There are two Ghazalis in Arab, Lembaga Peradaban Melayu. I don't know how to describe myself. Yes, thank you so much. It was a very, very excellent presentation you make. And I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much. I can't understand why. I find it very difficult to say to myself, I'm not an intellectual or an academic. I'm just a businessman. I'm writing a book called I'm from Southeast Asia to describe how I feel. If you come to my home, 5 languages are spoken because I come from a mixed marriage. Malay was father, Chinese mother, great-grandmother, Portuguese, Fonseca, And in my family, there were a lot of intermarriages. So if you come to my house, you can see me praying, Sembahyang, Salat, and also next door, my late grandmother on my Chinese side also praying. And then the other auntie, who's a Christian, saying her prayers in Christian. So I have problem in identifying who I am. I think this is the beauty of Southeast Asia, that we have this synergy of sorts. And that is why Malaysia is very different. And I subscribe to the view that, whilst religion, our official religion is Islam, but multiculturalism creeps through our body. And here I am now as a businessman. I very much involved in interfaith organizations. I was past vice president and chairman of the management committee of the Pure Life Society, which is a Hindu-based organization. And there I was chairman of a Hindu-based, and then I'm also advisor to the Malaysian Christian Federation, Malaysian Buddhist Society, Sikhism. But I feel so comfortable. I think this is the beauty of Southeast Asia. And that's why my company is called Nusantara Technologies, because Nusantara means archipelago. I think one of the reasons why Malaysia, inshallah, I hope it will continue to be so, is successful, is because we are very, very archipelago. We can absorb, modify, synergize, and strengthen ourselves through this variety. So I believe that what the government is now doing is taking that path, which is, I think, a correct path. And we are now finding ourselves. But Islam still remains the thing. And among my old good friends are members of royalty, whom I respect, who are very close to me, especially three sultans. They are my very close friends. And then, of course, I worked in Indonesia, I worked in Singapore, I worked in so many countries in ASEAN when I was working in the multicultural organization. My father served in the Foreign Service in London, and I went to school in England. And yet, it was a Catholic school, and I fitted well. I even took divinity as a subject, and I passed the test, although I'm a Muslim. So I tell myself, what the hell is going on? But it has enriched me, and it's made me very strong. And in my business, my company is called Nusantara Technologies, because of my heritage. It's doing very well. Alhamdulillah. So this is very important. So thank you very much for your paper. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you so much for your comment. And I am so happy that you are writing that book, because I do. Yes, because I do believe that people here and around the world need to learn about the story of Southeast Asia and Malaysia. And I think it's very important for younger generations here who might have maybe, let us also not forget, when we talk about global moment, yes, there is shifting to multipolarity, but there's also a global moment of shifting to right-wing xenophobic nationalism. But you mentioned BJP and so on. And unfortunately we hear those voices. So I think it's important that you're writing so the younger generation can truly understand what Malaysia is about, what Southeast Asia about, that these composite identities that have always been part and parcel of Nusantara really need to be preserved, like you said and like you said. And you see absolutely no contradiction with it. And that's the most beautiful thing about it. And so yes, exactly. Thank you so much. Yes. Oh. Oh.
So I go there.
It's not often you see people playing accordion here, so that's very interesting. But thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to reading your book.
Yeah, we started a bit late, but 10 minutes late. If you can make it quick, and maybe 1 minute, and maybe I'll end with Dr. Badis if you have any comments. No, okay. All right.
Khairuddin, I don't present any institution. We are talking about the future and looking at the Malaysia, unlike Indonesia, it is not 90% or Muslims or Malays. We have the other races and religion in this country. So sometimes you can see the friction sometimes, even like Jakim getting 1 billion. So people were asking, this year our taxpayers' money. So what is it going for? Only for Islam, not for the other religions. An example. Another one, I attended a talk by a PhD student, UK University Kebangsaan. She's studying on the concern of Islamization, the state into the everyday life of the Malaysian, especially even among the Muslims, especially the young group. Like trying to reintroduce, one state was trying to introduce to monitor whether you go for Friday prayers or not, for example. Or now it's getting more difficult to eat for women who have menstruation during fasting month. See? I can't even, she said, there were big discussion. If there is a rest R&R area, she cannot. Even sometimes she brings her young children. See? So this concern. I don't know how big is this movement or this concern, but talking about the future, how do you see Malaysia will handle this multiculturalism and multi-religiosity in the context of embedding Islamization? Thank you.
I don't have a crystal ball to look into to know what will happen. But I think a lot of it rides on the next election, because next election are going to be an indicator which way the country is gonna go. Is it the continuation of current policies, which seems to be more inclusive, more in line with what we all been discussing, or is it going to be a win for more xenophobic forces that are trying to, portray the other as the enemy? And so the only thing I can say is watch out for next elections and see what happens.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for the engaging discussion. And thank you once again, Dr. Ermin, for your insightful responses and valuable insights. Feel free to approach Dr. Ermin later in a more informal setting while we have our refreshments, if you still have the juice for that. But for now, I'll pass the mic to Ms. Mas. Maybe before that, a round of applause for Dr. Ermin.
Thank you, Mr. Wan Naim, and thank you, Dr. Ermin Sinanović, for a highly insightful and thought-provoking lecture, as well as the engaging discussion that followed. We trust that today's session has enriched our understanding of the diverse manifestations of political Islam and the unique experience of Southeast Asia within broader global debates. Ladies and gentlemen, as a token of our appreciation and gratitude, may I invite the Deputy Chief Executive Officer, Dr. Ahmad Badri of IIS Malaysia, to present a token of appreciation to our distinguished speaker, Dr. Ermin Sinanović. May I invite both gentlemen to the front?
to be in touch with